What my daughter-in-law did not know, on the morning she told me I was an embarrassment to this family, was that I had already spoken to my lawyer 3 days before. I am Norman Hatch. I am 67 years old, and this is the story of how I gave my son everything, and then took it all back. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer in Halifax. Not glamorous work, but honest work. I designed bridges, underpasses, road overpasses across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. I was good at it. When I retired at 63, I had a pension through the Nova Scotia Public Service, a paid-off house in Bedford, a secondary property in Truro that I had inherited from my father, and savings that, combined, put me in a position most men my age would consider comfortable. I was not wealthy in the way people imagine when they use that word carelessly. But I was secure. I had built something. My wife, Sandra, passed in 2019, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We had been married 38 years, and I will not pretend that after she was gone I was the same person. I was not. The house in Bedford felt enormous and pointless. I started eating poorly. I stopped keeping the garden the way she liked it. My son, Alec, called from Toronto every Sunday, and I appreciated that. He was attentive in those first months. Concerned. He flew out for Christmas that year with his wife, Christine, and their daughter, my granddaughter, Phoebe, who was 4 years old at the time, and who used to fall asleep on my chest while we watched the hockey game together. Those were the months I thought things would be all right. That grief was survivable, that I still had family. It was Christine's idea, though Alec presented it as his own. He called one evening in February 2021 and said he thought it would be good for all of us if I came to live with them in Toronto. They had a finished basement, he said. Private entrance, my own bathroom. I could help with Phoebe, be part of her life, stop rattling around alone in Bedford. He made it sound like an invitation. I understand now that it was a transaction. I rented out the Bedford house through a property management company. The Truro property, which I owned outright, and which generated about $1,400 a month in rental income, I kept separate. I want to be clear about that. I kept that account separate, in my name only, at a different bank. Something in me held back. I do not know what I was protecting against exactly. Call it instinct. Call it the part of Sandra that was still living in my chest and watching out for me. The basement in their house in Etobicoke was fine at first. Small, but fine. The private entrance was a door that led up 4 steps to the back garden, and in winter it let in a cold draft no matter what I did with the weather stripping. But I was close to Phoebe, and that made it bearable. I picked her up from school 3 days a week. I made her lunches. I helped her with her reading. She was a serious little girl, curious about everything, and spending time with her was the only part of those years that felt genuinely good. The arrangement with money was never stated clearly, which I think was deliberate. Alex suggested early on that I contribute to household expenses, which seemed fair. I agreed to $800 a month. Then Christine mentioned the cost of groceries had gone up, and could I add another $200, and I said yes. Then there was the matter of the car insurance, because I was driving Phoebe, and somehow I ended up paying that too. Then the internet, because I used it. Then a share of the hydro bill. By the end of the first year, I was paying close to $2,000 a month to live in a basement room that got 40 minutes of direct sunlight on a good day. I did not complain. I am not a man who complains easily. Sandra used to say that was one of my better qualities and also one of my worst. I stayed quiet, and I paid. And I told myself this was what families did. This was what it meant to be part of something. But Christine changed. Or perhaps she did not change, and I simply started seeing her more clearly. She had a way of speaking to me that was not quite rude, not the kind of thing you could point to directly, but that accumulated over time like water damage. A particular tone when she asked if I had remembered to wipe down the stove after I cooked. A specific silence when I sat in the living room in the evenings. Little things. The suggestion, never quite spoken aloud, that I was a guest who had overstayed, that my presence was a favor she was extending, rather than an arrangement we had all agreed to. It was Alec who said it to my face, in the kitchen one Saturday morning in November 2022. I had booked a seat to fly back to Halifax for a few days, to check on the property and see some old friends. I mentioned it at breakfast, and Christine said nothing, just left the room, and then Alec looked at me across the table and said, "Dad, you're spending money on things that don't make sense anymore. Flights, dinners out, that gym membership, you need to start being more careful. You can't afford to be careless with money at your age." I was 66 years old. I had a pension, I had rental income, I had savings. I was paying $2,000 a month to live in their basement, and my son was sitting across from me, in the house I had helped furnish, telling me I was being careless with money. I did not say anything. I got up, rinsed my coffee mug, and went downstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about Sandra. I thought about what she would have said. She would have been angrier than me. She always burned faster and hotter, and then it was over. I sat there for a long time, and something settled in me quietly, the way concrete sets. Not anger, just clarity. I called my lawyer Richard that same week. Richard had handled my affairs since before Sandra's illness, a calm and precise man in his late 50s who had an office on Barrington Street and who never made me feel rushed. I told him what the arrangement was, what I had been contributing, how the situation had evolved. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Norman, I want to ask you something. Have you ever put anything in writing with Alec and Christine about the financial arrangement?" I said no. He said, "Good. Then nothing is binding. Let's talk about your options." I did not tell Alec and Christine that I had spoken to Richard. I did not change my behavior. I continued picking up Phoebe, continued paying the monthly amount, continued eating dinner quietly at the kitchen table, while Christine talked about her work, and Alec looked at his phone. I was patient. I had been patient for 2 years. A few more weeks cost me nothing. What I did over those weeks was get organized. I called the property management company in Halifax and made sure the Truro rental income was going directly to my separate account, which it always had. I reviewed my pension arrangements with Service Nova Scotia. I contacted my financial advisor at RBC and asked him to review everything, to make sure my accounts were structured properly, to ensure nothing was jointly held with anyone else. It wasn't. I had been careful, without knowing exactly why. I also, quietly, looked at apartments. I was not interested in another retirement situation where someone else controlled my surroundings. I found a 2-bedroom unit in a building in Hamilton, close enough to Toronto that I could still see Phoebe regularly, far enough that I would have my own life. The building was clean, the management was responsive, the rent was manageable against my income. I put down a damage deposit on a Thursday afternoon, without mentioning it to anyone. The morning Christine called me an embarrassment. It was December. There had been a small gathering the evening before, some of their friends for dinner, and I had apparently committed the offense of telling a story about a construction project I had worked on in the 90s that had gone on too long, according to Christine, who told me so after the guests had left, in a voice that suggested she had been holding this grievance for some time. I had gone downstairs. The next morning she was in the kitchen when I came up to make coffee, and she said, with her back to me, "You made us look bad last night. You really need to understand how you come across to people. You're becoming an embarrassment." I poured my coffee. I said, "I understand." I went back downstairs. I called Richard that morning and told him I was ready. He told me what I already knew. I owed Alec and Christine nothing contractually. The monthly payments were contributions I had made voluntarily to a household I lived in. I had no joint accounts, no shared assets, nothing that connected my finances to theirs in any enforceable way. My Bedford house was managed independently. The Truro property was mine, my pension was mine, my savings were mine. I told Alec I needed to go back to Halifax to deal with some paperwork with the properties. He said fine. He did not ask much. He had stopped being particularly curious about my life, around the same time Christine had stopped being polite about it. I packed what mattered to me. Sandra's photographs, the small things of hers I had kept, my books, my good winter coat, my tools. I packed methodically, over 3 evenings while they were watching television upstairs. I was not dramatic about it. I did not leave in the night or slam a door. I simply packed, and on a Friday morning in December, while Alec was at work and Christine was in a meeting and Phoebe was at school, I carried my things to my car and I drove to Hamilton. I stopped the monthly payments effective that same day. I called the bank and confirmed. I called the property management company to confirm my Halifax rental income would continue to my account. I called Richard and told him I was out. He said, "Good. Now let's make sure it stays that way." Alec called that evening. I was sitting in my new apartment, on a chair I had bought that afternoon at a store down the street eating a sandwich. I let it ring. He called 3 more times. Then Christine called. Then Alec again. I did not answer any of them. I sent one text message to Alec that said, "I've moved out. I'm fine. Don't worry about me." I did not give an address. He called Richard's office the following week, demanding to know where I was. Richard, very calmly, told him that my whereabouts were my own business, that I had committed no wrongdoing, and that any further contact through his office should be in writing. Alec apparently told Richard that I was being irrational, that I needed help, that this was a mental health concern. Richard told me this on the phone, and I could hear the faint restraint in his voice. He had dealt with this kind of argument before. What Alec did not know, and this is the part that took him longest to absorb, was that I had updated my will, not out of spite, out of accuracy. The Bedford house would go, when I was gone, into a trust for Phoebe, managed by Richard, until she was 25. The Truro property the same. Alec was not removed from my life. He was removed from the expectation that my life was something he had a claim on. The weeks after I left were strange, not in a bad way. Strange the way wide open space feels strange when you have been in small rooms for a long time. I cooked what I wanted for dinner. I called my friends in Halifax, without thinking about whether the call was too long. I drove to the hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon just to look at things. Small freedoms. People do not understand how small freedoms accumulate until they have been without them. I started going to a community center near the apartment 3 mornings a week. There was a woodworking shop there, which I had not done since my 20s, and I started making things again. A small bookshelf, a stool, nothing complicated. The man who ran the shop, an older gentleman named Fletcher, was someone I began to look forward to seeing. We had coffee after, sometimes, and talked about nothing consequential, and it was exactly what I needed. Phoebe I handled differently. I was not willing to lose her. She was 6 by then, and I understood that she was not responsible for anything her parents had done. I wrote Alec a letter, a real letter, on paper, which I sent through Richard's office. I told him that I wanted to remain in Phoebe's life, that I was willing to arrange visits, that I had no interest in legal conflict and no interest in hostility, but that I had made my decision about my own living situation, and I would not be reversing it. I told him that what happened in that kitchen in December was not something I was willing to absorb and move past, and that I needed him to understand that before we could figure out what came next. He called me 6 weeks after the letter arrived. He was quieter than not on the call. He said he hadn't realized how bad things had gotten. He said he was sorry. I listened. I did not rush to tell him it was fine, because it was not entirely fine, and I thought pretending otherwise would not help either of us. I said I appreciated him saying it. I said I needed time. I said Phoebe could come stay with me for a weekend in February if he and Christine agreed, and I would take her to the science museum she had been asking about. She came in February. She slept in the second bedroom on a fold-out bed I had set up carefully, with the quilt from Sandra's cedar chest. We went to the science museum. We ate waffles at a diner nearby, and she talked without stopping about a book she was reading at school. On the second morning she climbed into my armchair while I was making coffee and sat there very still, and when I came back with my mug she looked up at me and said, "Grandpa, I'm glad you didn't disappear forever." I sat down across from her, and I looked at her serious little face, and I said, "I am not going anywhere, sweetheart. I just moved." She considered that for a moment, and then went back to her book. There is not a dramatic courtroom ending to this story. There is no scene where everything collapses for Alec and Christine in a single moment. Life is not usually arranged that way, and I am too old to pretend otherwise. What happened is slower and more real than that. They are still together. They still live in the same house in Etobicoke. Christine has not apologized, and I do not expect her to. Alec and I speak monthly now, sometimes more. It is not the relationship I hoped we would have, but it is more honest than what we had before. My finances are stable. My pension continues. The Halifax and Truro properties generate income. I am not rich, but I am secure, and I am secure entirely on my own terms without anyone else's hand on any part of it. What I lost was the version of my retirement I had imagined. The one where family meant closeness and meals together, and growing old surrounded by people who loved me without conditions. Sandra and I had talked about that. We had planned for it, in the vague and hopeful way people plan for things they assume will simply arrive. What I found instead was something I had not been looking for, the particular dignity of knowing that everything I have, I chose. The apartment I come home to, I chose. The mornings in the woodworking shop, I chose. The Sunday evenings on the phone with Phoebe while she tells me about her week, I chose. The grief I carry for Sandra, I carry it quietly, And it is mine, and no one else's hands are on it. I am 67 years old. I am not finished. And the money my son assumed was available to him, the house, the properties, the savings, the years of my work. It was never his. It was always mine. And now, finally, it is being used the way I intended. I turned the lights off in that basement for the last time on a Friday morning in December, and I did not look back.